Daniel Mercer stood in the field with the tractor idling behind him, looking at 70 feet of stacked rock running along the hillside, waist-high in places, thick enough that it had swallowed a strip of ground nobody had farmed in years. A neighbor pulled up along the fence line and leaned out his window. "You've got enough rocks there to build another barn," he said. "My grandfather never put anything there without a reason," Daniel answered. He climbed back onto the tractor and started clearing it anyway. If stories about old farms and the things left on them that turn out to matter more than anyone remembers belong to your kind of channel, subscribe to Old Farm Wells and tell us where you're watching from. It was the summer of 1987 in the hill country of southern Missouri, ground thin and rocky, laced with limestone close enough to the surface that a plow blade rarely made it across a field without striking something. Daniel was 42, farming ground that had belonged to his grandfather, gone unworked for years before Daniel bought it back with a bank loan larger than he liked to think about most mornings. He lived alone on the place since his father had died, a quiet man by nature, the kind who kept his own counsel and didn't much care whether the county agreed with how he ran his ground. The hillside gave him trouble on 3 fronts. Heavy rain washed topsoil down the slope every season, leaving pale, thin streaks where the good dirt used to sit. The tractor caught rock after rock working the upper ground, more some years than others, enough that Daniel had come to expect at least one broken shear pin a week during planting season. And the highest stretch of the hill, the steepest part, grew almost nothing worth harvesting no matter what he tried. Corn coming up thin and stunted, hay barely worth cutting. Right in the middle of that slope sat what everybody in the county called the old rock pile, and everybody assumed the same thing about it. Daniel's grandfather, clearing stone out of his fields the way any hill farmer did, had hauled the worst of it to one spot and left it there, the kind of pile every farm in that county carried somewhere on the property, an unremarkable fact of life on rocky ground. Daniel started pulling the larger stones loose with a chain behind the tractor, dragging them off to the field edge, one at a time, the work slow and jarring, the chain snapping tight against stone after stone. For the first 15 or 20 stones, there was nothing to see. Just rock, the kind any hillside in that county produced by the wagon load, worn smooth in places, sharp-edged in others, nothing that looked like it belonged to anything but a pile. Then he noticed something that stopped him mid-pull. The stones were not lying where they'd fallen at random. They ran in something close to a straight line, low and buried, the kind of order that doesn't happen by accident when a man is simply dumping rock out of a field. He knelt down and brushed dirt away from one edge, following it a few feet in either direction to be sure he wasn't imagining the pattern. He shut the tractor off and stood looking down the slope. Then he looked across to the far side of the hill. There was another line of stone there too, fainter, mostly sunk beneath the grass, but the same kind of order running along it, the 2 lines sitting roughly parallel to each other, the way nothing in a random pile ever would. Over the following days, Daniel kept digging, working with a shovel now more than the tractor, careful not to disturb whatever pattern he was starting to uncover. Under the soil he found flat stones fitted together with more care than a random pile would ever need, laid edge to edge rather than tossed in a heap, a low section of wall running beneath the loose rock he'd already cleared, old roots grown straight through gaps in the stonework where trees long gone had once tried to claim the ground, and layers of soil sitting at different heights on either side of the line, as though something had once held the ground back on one side while it dropped away on the other. This was not a pile. It was what remained of something built to run the length of the hillside. But built for what, Daniel still couldn't say, and he spent more than one evening that week turning the question over without landing on an answer that satisfied him. He mentioned it to a few neighbors that week, mostly out of curiosity more than anything, hoping somebody older might remember something about it, stopping by the feed store one afternoon to ask if anyone had ever heard their fathers talk about stonework on that hillside. They laughed. "It's just an old terrace," one of them told him. "Nobody farms that hill anymore anyway." Nobody in the county took it seriously, and Daniel had no strong argument to make back at them beyond a hunch and a few buried stones. Even the word terrace, tossed out so casually, didn't mean much to Daniel yet beyond a guess one man had thrown out without much thought behind it. The bank was still pressing him about the note, calling every few weeks to ask how the season was shaping up, and Daniel had no money to bring in the kind of equipment that would have made short work of clearing the whole hillside properly. No backhoe, no crew, nothing beyond what he already owned. All he had was time, a shovel, a chain, and a tractor. So that was what he used, working the ground back a few feet at a time whenever the rest of the farm didn't need him more urgently, usually in the early morning or the last hour before dark when the day's regular chores were done. It was slow, frustrating work, made slower by the fact that he still didn't know what he was uncovering or whether it would amount to anything worth the hours he was putting into it. More than once that week, watching the bank's deadline sit on the calendar in the kitchen, he considered leaving the rest of the hillside alone and putting his time into ground that already had a proven yield instead of chasing whatever lay buried under the grass. A few days later, higher up the slope, he found another wall, uncovered the same careful way, a few feet at a time with the shovel, brushing away decades of grass roots and washed-in soil. Then another, further up still, this one longer than the first two combined. By the time he'd worked his way most of the way up the hill, spending most evenings that week doing little else, the pattern was plain from where he stood at the top looking down. The stone lines ran in long, curving bands across the slope, each one following the shape of the hill rather than cutting straight across it, terrace after terrace stacked one above another all the way down to the field below, more of them than Daniel had thought to imagine when he'd started pulling stones out of what he'd assumed was one ordinary pile. The rock pile he'd started clearing had been only the smallest piece of something far larger. The whole hillside had been divided into a system of stepped terraces, and Daniel had stumbled onto the bottom edge of it without knowing what he was looking at. Standing there taking it in, he understood for the first time why the men at the feed store had used the word terrace so easily, even if none of them had known just how much of the hillside it actually covered. He still didn't fully understand how it worked, so he decided to test it the plain way, planting a short row of crop on one section of terrace he'd cleared and left more or less intact, choosing a stretch near the bottom of the slope where the stonework looked most complete. Not long after, a hard rain came through, the kind that usually stripped a good layer of topsoil off any exposed hillside in the county, the sky darkening fast enough that Daniel barely had time to get the tractor under cover before the first heavy drops hit. On the open ground higher up, where nothing held the slope, the rain cut through it the way it always had, carrying soil down toward the creek in muddy streaks that ran for hours after the storm passed. But on the terrace Daniel had cleared, the water slowed at each stone wall, dropping what it carried rather than sweeping it further down the hill. The soil stayed where it was, and when Daniel walked out the next morning to look, the difference between the two sections of hillside was plain enough that he didn't need to measure anything to see it. Daniel started to understand that whoever had built this hadn't simply stacked rock out of the way. They had designed the whole slope deliberately, to hold soil in place and make ground farmable that would otherwise have washed itself bare within a generation. Looking for more answers, Daniel went through an old wooden box in the barn he hadn't opened since he'd bought the place. One of several boxes he'd moved into the loft without much thought the day he took possession and never gotten around to sorting through. Inside were papers that had belonged to his grandfather, a hand-drawn map, folded soft at the creases from years of being opened and refolded, a handful of old receipts, most too faded to make out clearly, a notebook, its cover worn thin at the corners. A single sheet covered in numbers and marks Daniel didn't recognize at first glance, something between measurements and a code only his grandfather would have understood. The map showed a series of curving lines running across the hillside, matching almost exactly the terraces Daniel had just spent weeks uncovering, drawn with enough care that whoever made it had clearly walked the ground themselves rather than guessing from a distance. But one detail on it surprised him more than anything else he'd found so far. Based on the dates scattered through the notebook, some going back further than Daniel would have guessed, the system was already old by the time his grandfather had taken over the farm. His grandfather hadn't built it. He had only kept it standing. Daniel spent an evening asking around the County Historical Society, and an old-timer who still remembered stories passed down from his own grandfather, a conversation that ran long over coffee at the man's kitchen table while he tried to recall details he hadn't thought about in years. What he pieced together matched what the map suggested. Sometime around the turn of the century, the first farmers to work at Hillside had built stone terraces by hand to fight erosion on ground too steep to farm any other way. They had no tractors, no bulldozers, no irrigation systems, no modern fertilizer. What they had was manpower, local stone, and generations of hard-won experience about how water moved across a hillside, knowledge passed down by watching the land rather than reading it off any map or manual. Over the decades that followed, the system had simply been forgotten. Modern plowing methods came in and ran straight lines across ground that used to be worked in careful curves, faster and easier for men in a hurry to get a crop in the ground without walking the contour of the hill the way the terrace builders once had. Grass and soil crept back over the terraces year after year until all that remained visible to anyone driving past was a stretch of stone nobody could explain, easy enough to write off as farm waste, and nothing more. Daniel did not stop at clearing the original rock pile. Over the following weeks, he worked his way up the entire slope, section by section, uncovering terrace after terrace until the stone lines ran continuously from the crest of the hill down to the field below, the way they must have looked to the men who first built them, a project that ate most of his spare hours through the rest of that summer and left his hands rougher than they'd been in years. He planted corn on one terrace, beans on another, pumpkins and forage crop across the rest, working the curves of the hill instead of fighting them the way modern plowing always had, laying out each row by eye along the same contour, the old stonework already marked out for him. By the end of that season, the terraced ground was outproducing the flat, conventionally plowed fields on the rest of the farm, soil held firm through every hard rain that came through that summer, the crop standing thicker and greener on the terraces than anywhere else on the place. But the real discovery wasn't the yield. Walking the terraces near the end of that season, notebook in hand out of habit now, Daniel noticed that every stone line matched, almost exactly, the natural contour of the hill itself, following the slope, the way water would naturally want to move across it rather than cutting against the grain of the land. The men who built it had not fought the hillside. They had read it, understood exactly where the ground wanted to hold and where it wanted to let go, and built accordingly in a way modern farming methods, running straight rows without regard for the shape of the land beneath them, had simply forgotten how to do. Near the end of that summer, Daniel stood on the highest terrace with his grandfather's notebook in hand, looking down over the whole hillside below him. Near the back of the notebook, in his grandfather's handwriting, was a line Daniel hadn't paid much attention to on his first pass through the papers. "Don't move the stones. They know where the hill wants to hold." He looked out over the ground below him, terrace after terrace running in green curving bands down toward the field, crops growing in careful lines that matched the shape of the land rather than cutting against it, the same stone walls that had once been dismissed as nothing but a farmer's junk pile, now standing as the framework holding the entire hillside together. What the county had called farm waste turned out to be the skeleton of the whole farm, built by men whose names nobody in the county remembered anymore, kept alive by a grandfather who never explained why, and rediscovered by a man who had only meant to clear a rock pile out of his way. Daniel never did finish clearing it the way he'd first intended. He restored it instead, terrace by terrace, the same way his grandfather once had, without ever writing down the reason why. If this is the kind of story you come back for, there's a subscribe button below, and we'd like to know where you're watching from. Would you have kept clearing that rock pile, or stopped the moment you noticed the stones ran in a line?